What does political chaos really look like? We're going to find out as we investigate this great movie, number 38 in my series, What Makes This Movie Great. It's the 1966 classic, The Battle of Algiers. Coming up next. Made in the mid-1960s by the Italian director Pontecorvo, The Battle of Algiers is a very famous movie about the Algerian revolts against the French colonialist government, which took place in the mid to late 1950s all the way through the early 1960s. This is a very rare great movie in that it has no star, no main character. The main character is actually the series of events that it depicts. And you get a cast of hundreds, if not thousands in this movie. There are a couple of major minor characters that you see throughout the movie, including a young Algerian man who is harassed and then arrested at the beginning of the movie. And then a French military officer wearing very dark sunglasses, looking like the policeman in Psycho, and a little bit like Darth Vader, as the leader of the French police movement, which takes place and ramps up in the middle of the movie. The movie describes a whole series of events that unfortunately modern people, modern viewers of today in 2020, they might be all too familiar with. Places around the world have had revolts, terrorism, harsh government crackdowns including police and military action. This movie depicts those kinds of things in Algeria in the 1950s and 60s. The French had occupied Algeria for, as the movie says, 130 years prior to the 1950s. But you see early on in the movie, there's a desire on the part of the Algerians in general to revolt against the government for whatever reason and to kick out their occupiers. This movie is very heavily, I find, an anti-imperialist movie. And it's definitely part of the spirit of its age. At this time in the mid-20th century, so many countries were undergoing these kinds of revolts, or the imperialists, whether French or British or other European countries, were backing out of countries all over the world. And you also have the spirit of revolt in European countries and in America, especially with the Vietnam War. This movie was released in 1966. By 1968, you get all kinds of student protests in Europe and America. And that's what I mean by the spirit of the age. This movie captures it perfectly, using the Algerian revolt of 10 years prior to showcase what those kinds of revolts ought to look like. I find this movie to be very disturbing, not entertaining at all. Admittedly, I have never sat down to watch this movie all the way through. I usually have to watch this in segments, watching part of it, 40 minutes worth, leaving, coming back to it a day later. Because I just can't take the whole movie as it is. Part of it is the movie is highly realistic. It's been praised for a pseudo-documentary style, and it's been called realistic, or it's been put under the umbrella of neo-realism from the European directors in the 1950s and 60s. Now that's true to an extent. The movie captures all kinds of crazy, terrible things. The bombings of businesses and cafes. The police and military crackdowns in an urban environment. Teams and hordes of people weeping and wailing after bombings. Those same kinds of groups or mobs forming to attack the police. The murders of policemen. The whole movie seems to show, in a documentary style as I said, the way in which the Algerian revolts might have happened. But, of course, this is a movie, and that's an illusion. Although it's highly realistic, this movie is highly expressionistic as well. What's inside the frame, the content of it looks realistic, but clearly the camera movements and the editing show that this is a highly constructed work. It's definitely part of the French New Wave, the expressionistic New Wave going on in Europe, in the movie world in the early 1960s. And so you have this wonderful and disturbing mix of realism and expressionism. What it would look like to be in the Algerian revolts just 10 years prior to this movie's release, but also what it would feel like to be in the midst of them. I think that's where this movie, as a statement of social, political disturbance, as a statement of urban warfare in the mid-20th century, which, is a lot like urban warfare in the late 20th century. Just watch the movie Black Hawk Down from Ridley Scott. Very similar in a lot of ways to this movie. I think that's what makes this movie for me so disturbing, is that I know what I'm watching. These kinds of events have happened worldwide, unfortunately, in the last 60, 70, 100 plus years. And unfortunately, they might continue to happen still. Now, let me give you a tad bit of philosophy about this movie. I think this movie is partly about the Platonic idea of thumos. For Plato, go look it up in his Phaedrus and his Republic, those great dialogues. The thumos is the middle part of human nature. It's to be governed by logos, but thumos is, in part, the desire to be seen and to be noticed and to be respected by others, especially by governments. It's a seat of emotions, anger, fear, happiness, elation. Translators call thumos spiritedness. And if you think about spiritedness, think about a wild horse bucking and jumping around. That's a lot like what unhindered thumos is. Now, in political terms for Plato, when thumos goes wild, you have revolts, you have rebellions, you have mob actions. And when you get other people involved and you look and see other people and begin to imitate them when they're running wild and when they're very angry about injustices in particular, you're going to have these kinds of revolts and mob actions and group wars depicted in Battle of Algiers. When thumos is on the loose, you get scapegoats. You get innocent people gunned down. You get bloody revolts. Now, whether it's just or unjust doesn't matter, because once the revolt or rebellion gets going, it's all-out warfare as depicted by this movie, especially the way the Battle of Algiers ends. Plato would have us govern our spiritedness and our eros, our passions, our erotic passions, our base passions especially, by logos, by the rule of philosophy. But if there is no rule of philosophy, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying what Plato says, then you're going to get the sort of chaos depicted, in the Homeric epics, but especially in Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid, where chaos and civil war run wild throughout almost the entire epic, and everybody in it, well, the good people in it, desire social order. Certainly when I watch the Battle of Algiers, that is what I desire. Really bothers a person like me who is high on social order and order in general. But as a depiction of what people went through and what people want politically, socially, economically, this movie does a fabulous job. And whether you agree with it, whether or not I agree with what this movie is saying, taking the anti-imperialist side, the Algerian side, the filmmaking in this is absolutely tremendous. Anybody who's into video making movies, whether they disagree with this movie or not, can gain a lot from this movie's use of techniques and style. You want to call this a propaganda movie? Then it's a great propaganda movie. Now, I do find it to be a little disingenuous. The director is an Italian, not a Frenchman, not an Algerian, and he was part of the Communist Party. He was definitely a Marxist. And admittedly, I dislike communism strongly. It's an economic, social, political system that doesn't work. It doesn't scale up beyond about 20 people in a commune. So for this Italian Marxist director to root for the Islamic Algerians is, to me, a little strange, and I doubt this really would be a place he wants to live in and root for. I think he was making this movie in service of the European protests against whatever tyrannies they thought they were facing within Europe, particularly France and Italy. However, as I said, even if you disagree with the director's point of view, how it's depicting the events in this movie, the filmmaking is absolutely incredible, including the shot making and the editing. So for those reasons alone, I can call the Battle of Algiers a great movie. And as long as we have these sorts of problems with oppressors and the oppressed, with colonialists and the people whose lands they occupy, this movie might continue to be watched, even though the significance of its historical moment might be lost. And you know what? Occupied and occupiers, those problems have been around a long time. Just read the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot of it is about that particular problem. And last, what movie do I think the Battle of Algiers influenced? Probably the most famous movie ever, or one of them. Yep, the famous and beloved anti-imperialist work, Star Wars. Have you seen this movie, Battle of Algiers? What do you think of it? Please leave us a comment. And if you haven't, please subscribe to my channel to support what we're doing. Thank you and have a great day.